Math 1342, Section 1.3, Experiments and Observational Studies. Video 3, Experiments versus Observational Studies. So what exactly is an experiment and what exactly is an observational study? Well, you're probably familiar with experiment from a science context. In a class like chemistry, you experiment by manipulating values of variables, the amount of this that you add to the amount of that, the temperature to which you heat it. And so that would be, well, an experiment. But the main difference between an experiment and an observational study is in an experiment, you are controlling something, whereas in an observational study, you are just observing something and not controlling it. An experiment is a study in which the researcher actively controls one or more of the explanatory variables. By contrast, an observational study is a study in which the researcher does not actively control the value of any variable, but simply observes the values as they naturally exist. Let's take a look at a couple of examples. Both studies below are designed to examine the effect of fertilizer on the yield of an apple orchard. Indicate whether each method of collecting data is an experiment or an observational study. A. Researchers find several different apple orchards and record the amount of fertilizer that had been used and the yield of the orchards. B. Researchers find several different apple orchards and assign different amounts of fertilizer to each orchard. They record the resulting yield from each. Which is A, an experiment or an observational study? Let's see. This is an observational study. Since data were recorded after the fact and no variables were actively manipulated. Notice that there are many possible confounding variables that might be associated with both the amount of fertilizer and the yield, such as the quality of soil or the time of year. But in B, the researchers were intentionally controlling the amount of fertilizer to each orchard, which means this is an experiment since the amount of fertilizer was assigned or controlled to different orchards. The researchers actively manipulated the assignment of the fertilizer variable in order to determine the effect on the yield variable. Now, which do you think is easier to conduct, an experiment or an observational study? The answer is an observational study because it doesn't have the added task of controlling variables, of saying, well, first let's do it this way, and now let's do it this way, and now let's do it this way. For an observational study, you just look, maybe measure, gather data, but you're not controlling any variables. So the observational study is actually easier to conduct, but there's a causation caution. It is difficult to avoid confounding variables in observational studies because you're not controlling anything. So there may be a third variable associated with the variables that you're studying. For this reason, observational studies can almost never be used to establish causality. Let me repeat that. Observing can't be used to conclude causality because you're not controlling any confounding variables that might actually be causing the causality, as opposed to just some association between two variables.